At first glance, many of Pandora's species seem to do the same thing. But look closer, and each occupies its own ecological niche. Welcome, or welcome back to another episode of Pandora through a biologist's eyes. For this episode, we are going to talk about something that you might have heard me mention in some of my other videos, and that is ecological niches. So, an ecological niche is basically something that describes the kind of like the vacation, the slot that an animal, a plant, or any other living being can fill in an environment, in an ecosystem. So, for example, having an ecological niche is something, or each ecological niche is unique. Sorry, I was distracted. Like over there's like some cloaked panthers. I think they're trying to hunt something. Well, anyways, so ecological niches are something that is very specific, and an ecological niche can only be filled by one species. So it has very, very certain requirements to fill that role. So once another animal comes in, or another plant, which is when invasive species become a problem, that fits the same niche, they compete for the same resource. So even if you have animals, for example, if you have lions or leopards, they're both predatory cats, but they have slightly different niches. So even though they're both predators, they tend to hunt different prey. A little different. While lions go bigger, leopards tend to go a bit smaller, so they overlap still, but they still don't fight don't have the same exact resources. It's like this on Pandora as well. So for example, we have those pack hunters, like the cloaked panthers, and then we have pack hunters in the Kinglor Forest as well, which would be the viper wolves, and we have some sort of pack hunter all over the place. Like each ecosystem of Pandora has their own very unique plants and animals. So they have different species, but more or less the same niches. So we have pack hunters that hunt medium to small-sized prey, and then we have large predators. Although the venator is pretty unique, but I'm gonna go into a little bit of detail in a bit. But for now, I just want to help you understand a little bit an ecological niche. So it is a system with, like nature, there are certain limitations. So resources are limited, and we have like different soil levels, for example, like with different nutrients in there. And of course, with animals, they have different adaptations. So usually an animal is adapted to fit its ecological niche. With plants, of course, it is the same. So if a new environment sometimes opens up, for example, a new island forms, or animals can travel around, they might encounter species that already are there, but then they can kind of like take their place instead. So that's just something that happens with ecological niches, because when two animals, I know I always say animals, it's because I'm more of a zoologist than a plant person, but if you hear me say that, I always mean plants as well, and of course fungi and other organisms. But basically, the niche can only be filled by one species. So when two species compete, one of them is going to lose. So either they adapt or they disappear. And ecological niches are interesting because it doesn't really matter where we are on the world or where we are on Pandora. If there's like a similar niche, the animals have adapted similar to it. So we have, for example, large grazing animals. We have the bladeheads in the plains, and then we have the stern beast or the bonehelm rhino in the Kinglor and clouded forest. Same goes for our earth animals. We have bison in the Americas, so North America specifically, and we have buffaloes in Africa. So the Cape buffaloes, for example. And then we have different types of bovids, like those gaur and other animals in Asia, which are kind of like large bovine animals. And of course, ecological niches can be filled by the same type of animal. For example, big cats kind of like, this dominate the ecosystem they're in. Think of lions and tigers. But it can also be filled by completely different animal groups. For example, there are no bovines or larger bovines or antelopes in the Andes, for example. So here we have those camelids, the llama, because they belong to the group of camels like the guanaco or the vicuña. And the same niche being like, those plateau grassland is, for example, filled by horses in the Eurasian steppes, or was filled. They're pretty much extinct to a certain degree. So you have different habitats that kind of like have the same requirements for an animal to survive, and that's basically the ecological niche. It does everything sounds a lot more complicated than it actually is, because it comes down to, is the animal adapted to it? And if we look at an, like for example, a little lizard is adapted to survive in the Australian desert, and then we look at lizards that are adapted to survive, for example, in Death Valley in North America, we have similar adaptations of the animals, but there's like two groups they would never meet, but they still look similar, which is then convergent evolution, because these traits are necessary to survive in these environments, and so they have developed far away from each other, and the animal still looks similar. So ecological niches are something that's very interesting, and we see that on repeat on Pandora as well, so you might have heard me mention it a lot of times. And the thing is with Pandora, a lot of the animals, they share, of course, the same behavior. So we have the pack hunters, and it is a video game after all. So we have some similarities with real world, of course, but it's not as intricate as it could be like in real life, because nature can be complicated, and trying to reproducing it to a realistic level is really, really hard, and you would probably need a bunch of supercomputers to even play the game. But it is very interesting still to see that they have it to a certain degree. So we have our pack hunters, and they hunt those smaller herbivores that they roam, and they have similar behaviors. They're skittish, the larger ones are aggressive. That's why it's very nice that you use this game as an example. So when we're in Pandora, and we just look at the basics, especially when it comes to predators, or just like also herbivores, because those are the big things that we can see, and having different types of animals that you can interact with, or even plants that you can get materials of, that's of course important because it is a video game. Although I do have to say, even though this is the video game is canon. So everything in the video game has been confirmed to be also tied, or in this video game, tied into the movies. So we have characters that appear in the movies are linked into that as well. So I think pretty towards the DLC that we have, Fire and Ash, or like the third DLC that came out for this game, it directly links to the movie, the third movie that came out. So we actually have characters, I think, towards I have not finished the Fire and Ash one yet, but with the Spire's DLC towards the end, there is a short, kind of like you hear, I think it's a Quaritch, the bad guy that was human first, now is a Navi. So I was just looking what they look at. So he has a message. So everything in that game is kind of like we can use for the movies as well, or like generally the Avatar universe logic. Which is why I dare to assume some things for the movies as well, even though it's not really shown in the movies, because we can just stand and stop. And that's something I always like to tell people that don't really like video games, because you're basically in the movie. Like, I can just walk around and I can just go over there, which you can't, of course, do in watching a movie. You can go over there and just, punch that. Okay, that is a very, very nice purple. But I'm going to go a little bit into detail for each of the animals, so you see what I mean when I say, they have similarly adapted and they look similar. So if we look at different habitats, we have different ecological niches. And these ecological niches can, of course, diverse, and they're really affected by the habitat. And if we always look at the scale of what we look at, we have different ecological niches. So if we, for example, look at a tree, each part of the tree can be its own habitat. So every species living on that tree or around that tree has a different ecological niche. So we have animals that live at the base of the tree, at the roots. We have animals that live on the midsection of the tree, which would, for example, insects. But then we have different types of animals, or insects also in this case, that live on the top or the leaves. And so that's kind of like an easier, or using it as an example. And that, of course, also affects larger animals. So if we look at different habitats, it doesn't have necessarily, it's not even Pandora, but also Earth. If we have animals that kind of like look similar, have similar roles, but they're like on completely opposite ends of the world. And we have that on Pandora 2 on a smaller scale, because we have those three large biomes, which are, of course, the plains, the clouded forest, and the Kinglor Forest. We also have the DLC areas, but they are kind of like part of the clouded forest and part of the plains. But the thing is, I always try to explain it, or try to explain it as naturally as I can. But with that, with this still being a game, we have so many aspects that kind of like glanced over and that like biologically are just kind of like, to slap it over and let it slide. So a lot of things are kind of like a little bit neglected, especially when it comes to plants. So there's like basic, oh, this is this type of tree, this is that, but a lot of stuff doesn't even have a name. And when it comes to animal and species, they aren't as diverse. So we have, of course, some of the larger species have names, such as the thanators, and there's different types of thanators, or a lot of the herbivores, because we can kind of like kill them for material. But at the end of the day, it's still kind of like, more or less the same animals kind of rotating. But if we look at those animals, for example, the small herbivores, we also see some differences there. So if we look at the plains, you've seen a few animals already. We have the dire horses. There are dire horses also in the plains, and they're also in the Kinglor Forest. But we also had those little things that we saw running there earlier, the arrow deer. Now, if we look at the arrow deer, this is the information. The arrow deer is small and nimble. Very thin, very quick, kind of defenseless. So here we have the hexapede. And if we take a look at the hexapede, we will see that it is kind of have a similarity. I mean, ignore the 6 legs, but like just like the shape, it's very thin, nimble, and it's occupying its habitat is the Kinglor Forest. So we already have 2 animals that look kind of similar, but they live in different ecosystems on Pandora, different habitats. So one's in the rainforest area, the Kinglor, and the other one is in the plains. So those are 2 animals that kind of like share the same ecological niche, which would be like a small, quick herbivore, but they are in different habitats. So here we have another animal, which is the murre deer. And the murre deer, similar to the hexapede and the arrow deer, is again a smallish herbivore, and it's also from the clouded forest. So if we look at the thanator, we have seems to be more or less the same species, or at least subspecies are more or less closely related to each other, and they just have different variations depending on where they appear. So this, the Kinglor wetland thanator, is of course from the Kinglor Forest, and we have then the boulderland, and this is the normal thanator. But if we look at pack hunters, we have different types of pack hunters. We have our echo stalker here, which is in the clouded forest, and it is a pack hunter. We have, of course, the cloaked panther, which is also a pack hunter, and it is in the plains. Another pack hunter that is also has its appearance in the movies is the viper wolf. So we have already 3 animals that kind of share similar roles in nature. So they're pack hunters, they're small to medium sized, they're able to take down prey larger than them, but they all occupy different habitats. So we have, again, ecological niche in different habitats, but it's the same ecological niche for these species. And if we look at similarities, we also have this animal, the chameleon crawler, and we can find it in the clouded forest, specifically the white moss forest, which is a biome of the clouded forest. And we also have this animal, the scarab crawler, and we can find this one in the Kinglor Forest. So they have kind of like, maybe if we look at them, different origins. It could of course happen because an ancestor or even the same population later split up by exploring new ecosystems, finding new niches, so maybe they expanded. But an ecological niche does not necessarily have to be filled by a related species. If the habitat is further away, it could also be filled by something completely else. So we have animals that kind of look similar, even though they're not related, and that is, of course, convergent evolution. And a good comparison, of course, are marsupials and placenta animals. So placenta animals are pretty much ruling the Earth at this point, but marsupials are still stuck to Australia, and they have their niches there. So if we look at them, they have kind of like, even though they are completely different with different origins, they occupy the same roles. So a very good interesting fact is if we look at the Thylacolchos, which is a marsupial, or was a marsupial animal, and the Smilodon. That of course also affects bigger things such as trees, because we have those cloud pine trees that we can find in the clouded forest. Then in the rainforest we have, for example, these stairfoot trees. So just looking at the tree being a large structure, they have the similar ecological niche, but it's a completely different habitat. We also have them in the plains, which of course are those windswept trees. But for them it is a bit harder because they have, harder conditions. But still, it's a tree. They have same or similar ecological niche to some of the other trees. And usually, if we look at a system where there's, like for example, a forest, we have different types of trees that can cohabitate because they have slightly different needs. For example, soil, or all their roots are a bit different. So we have trees. So if we look at the Kinglor Forest, we have trees such as this starefoot tree, but also trees such as this the twisted scale tree. So they have slightly different habitats. So, but they still grow in the more or less larger area, which is the Kinglor Forest. Now here we have in the clouded forest, we have these coniferous trees, and they are large and they grow up to the top, and they remind me of redwood trees, or like the different species of redwood trees that we have on Earth. So now we are in the Kinglor Forest, and as you can see, we also have large trees here. So they have the same kind of like, they grow tall, outgrow all of the other trees in the area, but they're completely different. So we have, same niche, different habitat. So another good example when it comes to, same similar area, which we're here now in the clouded forest, are these trees. So they're more reddish colored. And we also see in the distance those coniferous looking trees. But in this particular spot, these reddish broadleaf looking trees seem to have an advantage towards those coniferous trees, which is also something that's, there's a little bit different in the area. And even though this area is, dominated by the coniferous trees, there might be something different with the ground that, has these trees, dominating. So now we are in the Kinglor Forest, and even though it looks different, when we look at it, we can see that was the grasses that grew in the plains are here replaced by those fern broadleaf-like little plants, but they're still small, and they kind of like share the same ecological niche, or they have the same habitat needs in a way. They need lots of direct light. So even though they look different and they're completely different species, they're still kind of like, the growing in full light plants. Alright, now I'm underwater, and a lot of the plants that we can see underwater have been recycled. So we've see them in all of the habitats. One thing I have to mention, because we're in an area where the habitats are still somewhat connected, but like not on completely different ends of the planet here, or technically a moon, I think, Pandora. But if habitats can be reached, that of course we can have the same species or subspecies of that species occupy, the same area. For example, this type of fern, we've seen that all over the place, and I don't think it's specified to be its kind of like own type of fern. But we also have animals and plants and fungi that kind of like have the same role of a very, very wide habitat, just because they're so versatile. So here we have a hexapede, and now we can see a hexapede in nature. It looks a bit different, but compared to the arrow deer, but it is still the small, nimble creature, and kind of like the same niche, even though it is a different habitat with the arrow deer. Now we're in the clouded forest, and again, even though the area it's different than the Kinglor or the plains, but on ground level, we also have some types of plants that, again, like the grasses or those dense foliage that we saw in the Kinglor, they thrive in open areas. So they kind of like need the open spaces to grow. And here we have the animal I was looking for, and that is the murdeer. So the murdeer has a pretty interesting behavior, where it comes to this little movement here. But if we look at it, it's small, it is decently nimble. So it has, again, it's kind of like the smallish herbivore, such as our arrow deer and our hexapede. And look, if I run at it, it's running off. Now if we just walk here in the plains, and we can already hear them, the arrow deer. And we can see them over there too. Oh, something just scared them. But as we see, arrow deer, small, nimble, quick. And then we have floating rocks here. That's just a texture glitch though. Now if we look at larger animals, we have of course the bonehelm rhino, which so far I haven't really shown too much because it is in the boggy areas, the wetlands of the clouded forest. It is more or less defensive, so I'd say it's in between the hammerhead, titanotheres, and the stern beast. So stern beasts are more passive. They don't, I mean, they run a little bit into you, but then they run off. So the stern beast's counterpart in the plains would be the bladehead. So it's still more of a medium-sized, decently nimble, but not all too defensive animal. And here we have our hammerhead titanotheres. And the titanotheres is definitely large, and I think it is the largest herbivore that we have in the Kinglor Forest, and we can find in the Kinglor Forest, and we can definitely compare it to be somewhere in between the bonehelm rhino when it comes to defensive abilities and the soundblast colossus, because different habitats still, even though the ecological niche is similar, they have different rules and different limitations. So you can only grow as big as you can because it is limited by food and water and also different other resources. And of course we have animals, because again the game seems to be pretty neglectful when it comes to the smaller things, such as this one here. Also some animals that I see run all over the place, those are the Jotun, those big amphibious looking ones. So sadly the game has, it's very interesting and there's so much you could do. And the other thing we of course have, because it is still a game, the comparison that we have to, our Earth stuff. So could be convergent evolution, could be game design. We also have this in a more kind of gameplay sense when we look at some of the materials we can get, for example, those shells. So we have different types of shells, which of course still a video game used for crafting. But there are different shells around. We also have examples of smaller animals, like for example they're called the Kinglor Forest hatchet bees, and they produce those swamp hive nectars. And they're found in the Kinglor Forest. Comparable with the same ecological niche are the clouded forest hatchet bees, which are found in the Kinglor Forest as well, interestingly, but they specify to be a different type of Pandoran bee. But they do share similarities, so they have those swarms and they make hives which produce some sort of honey. But by just looking at this, and if we look at these two, of course it's just this different different coloration on it, more or less the same thing, because again after that it's still a video game. But that's how nature works. We have different types of animals that share in different habitats that have similar roles. So ecological niche is not something that just affects animals. Of course plants, fungus, and pretty much everything else has an ecological niche as well. And again, if we look at the plants and fungi we have in-game, if we, for example, just look at this crimson mushroom or this dodo shroom, they kind of look similar, which is, of course, again, it is a game, so for resources, it's the same more or less model, but just slapped a different texture on it. But it still shows that they're, similar looking, and then they have different, and they have the same role, and we can find them in the same locations, but it's a completely different habitat. Yeah, and the insects and the flyers. I mean, of course, flyers can reach different habitats, which makes them a bit easier for them to traverse the areas. So they could kind of same species spread out further and occupy, the same ecological niche over a large area. But the game also, if we look at some of the plants that we can find, such as those carnivorous pitcher plant looking ones, which basically are just the same similar earth pitcher plants with just a bit larger with a different coloring on them. Which could, of course, to hint to it being convergent evolution at Earth, but also like, oh, they are related to Earth because of some weird game movie mechanic or whatever. Because after all, it's still a game. But I still think that I could, use it, or hope I did a good job, explaining a little bit how nature works. Even though this game is limited because, like, just what nature produces and the diversity that we have on Earth, it's, would take, I don't know how many, like it would take, I don't know how many supercomputers to create a game that is, able to represent the diversity that we have even on a small scale level, because it's just so complex. But with the species that we have, especially the herbivores, I'm just looking, I thought I heard something. The herbivores that we have in this game, and also some of the carnivores, being pack hunters over and sharing certain hunting strategies, like, chasing prey, being in packs, or survival strategies such as the small herbivores. Even though they kind of look different and they have a slightly different behavior, they still are the small, nimble herbivores. So I hope I was able to explain it somehow. It is a complicated theme if you don't want to dive in but once you kind of understand it a little bit, you're able to see the connections. For example, at one point you might go visit and you look at buffalo, for example, Cape buffalo in Africa, and you look at a bison from North America, you'll be like, oh, they're, bovine animals, bovids. They look kind of similar. They have somewhat a similar niche. They're large herbivores forming herds, grazing, migrating. So that's the same niche. Or if we look at an antelope or a deer from Europe, so antelope from Asia or America, they're small, they're nimble, and then compared it to deer, even though they're not that closely related, they still have the same niche, some similar behavior when it comes down to it, like, being herd animals, traversing in groups, migrating. So it's really interesting once you see the connections and you can interpret them and you can recognize them. Well, I do hope you enjoyed that episode. I know it was a bit more of a, biology lecture. I tried to incorporate as much as I could from the game and show you a little bit of the landscape while I was trying to explain it. Of course, we have I tried to incorporate the Hunter's Guide and give you a moment to read it if you're, of course, interested in it. Well, I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed it. And with that, I wish you a good day. Bye!